In the last week, in cities across the United States and Europe, especially on college campuses, we have seen a flood of anti-Israel, even pro-Hamas protesters who have sought to grind urban life to a halt and in some cases have even threatened and harassed Jewish citizens and students. What is the moral significance of these protests, and what irrational thinking leads people, and a surprising number of people, to support them? Well, welcome to New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. That's the question we will discuss today. My name is Ben Baer. I'm a fellow at ARI. With me is senior fellow at ARI, Onkar Ghate. Hi, Onkar.
Hi, Ben.
So let's dive right into some of the details of what we've seen unfolding in the West in the last few weeks, some of the more grisly details, unfortunately. So about 2 weeks ago, we saw major protests that shut down the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, shut down access to O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Many of the streets of major cities clogged by protesters occupying space, protesting on behalf of Gaza against Israel. But as I mentioned, especially on college campuses, and this drama continues, especially at Columbia, as of this morning, where a series of protests over the last week culminated the end of last week with trespass by a large number of occupiers, Occupy Wall Street style, at Columbia and other major campuses like Yale and NYU. These last were especially triggered by the president of Columbia giving congressional testimony, where she was grilled by the House Education and Workforce Committee, in the same way that the presidents of University of Pennsylvania and MIT were grilled to some acclaim some months ago. This time, the view was that the Columbia president was too deferential to Congress, giving too many details about the internal affairs and the hiring and firing of professors. This outraged protesters at Columbia, who then occupied the campus, invaded the campus. They had been emboldened by various concessions the university had made to their cause. And we'll talk in a moment about the role of the police in these protests. But the real news has been some of the things actually happening at these protests, some of the things being said, the way in which they've threatened students and other citizens, especially what sound like overt expressions of anti-Semitism, at least highly bigoted anti-Israel statements. And just by way of getting a flavor of this, I think I'd like to share with you all, with our audience, a clip, a video. Let's cue up video number one. This was the compilation of videos that was shared at the congressional hearings on Thursday of some of the things that had happened just at Columbia University in New York as of Thursday. And this doesn't even include things that have happened since then, but it'll give us a flavor. So let's take a look at this one.
Fuck Israel! Fuck the Jews!
We will disrupt you in the streets. We will close down the bridges. We will disrupt you in restaurants. We will turn your life into a nightmare.
Palestinian martyr, I want you to chant with me. We will honor all the martyrs. We will honor all the parents, fathers.
It's worth unpacking the significance of some of those statements for some who might not be familiar. When you're honoring every single Palestinian martyr, you're honoring everyone who's done a suicide bombing, everyone who's done a terrorist attack. The turning the ship around in Yemen refers to the Houthi rebels who've who've taken hostage and attacked ships going through the Red Sea, which is an overt act of aggression against innocent commercial interests. So there's this really quite stunning things being said at Colombia, and that's just what happened as of Thursday. So reviewing some of the things that have happened since then, but even before that weren't noted in the compilation. I mean, we had news of how late March there was at Colombia an event called Resistance 101, where a former official of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Khalid Barakat, referred to his friends and brothers in Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and PLFP in Gaza. At Colombia, we heard chants of Jews go back to Poland. We heard someone saying, never forget 7th of October, this will happen 10,000 more times. We had then notoriously, and this is a clip that's really made its way around the internet, put this one, video 4 up on screen as well. This one's very brief. And here you've got presumably one Columbia student standing in front of a group of other pro-Israel students saying Al-Qassam's next target. Al-Qassam is the military wing of Hamas. And so there's really, Onkar, there's really quite, it's hard to articulate just how awful some of the things we've seen at Columbia and elsewhere have been. I wonder if you have any initial reactions before we go into the other items.
So much of what is seen is pure evil, and I think it's important to not just hold it as it's anti-Semitism, though it's certainly major parts of it are anti-Semitism. There's a real animus against the Jews, against Israel, and I think particularly because Israel is a successful state, and we can come back to that. But what I think should really shock is what they're supposedly for. So you put it in the opening that they're even pro-Hamas. I think so many of them are pro-Hamas, just period. They're pro-Hamas. And you see some of that in what was shown in the congressional hearing of the videos you just played. It's not just they're anti-Israel, they're pro-Hamas. And that means they're pro an organization that is a religious totalitarian organization that seeks to deprive everybody under its power of their rights and of their freedom, including, crucially, the Palestinian people. This is it's a dictatorship in Gaza, and it wants, if you want this to expand, what you want is dictatorship to expand across the Middle East. And that, if that is your viewpoint, it is pure evil. In the protest of what was just played, of them praising Yemen. Yemen is in a civil war. And if you've read some about it, it's more gruesome than what's happening in Gaza in terms of the killing. And if that doesn't bother them, it's like, we'll praise Yemen because they stopped some Israeli ships, but the killing that goes on there, so the idea like they're anti-war or something like that, that's a farce. They don't care what's happening in Yemen. They don't care what's happening in Syria. Many people have made this point that if you actually cared about innocent loss of life in the Middle East, your focus would not be on Israel. Your focus would be on these regimes that are actively killing all kinds of people. Civil war in Syria, civil war in Yemen. And the fact that that's not what animates them, and indeed they praise these regimes, that is, I mean, you're at such a depth of evil that it's close to unspeakable.
And one comparison that is naturally suggested here is the protests that occurred on the University of Virginia campus, I think maybe it was 4 years ago, where there were right-wing protesters, the so-called Unite the Right rally, carrying torches, in some cases chanting, "Jews shall not replace us." And these were rightly condemned by the left, I think also by most people on the right, as violent, as unjust, as racist. But here we have not just a protest on a single campus involving a relatively small group, which is what happened with UVA. We have a whole series, a whole network of protests on multiple campuses in multiple countries even, but which are being widely tolerated. I mean, the police have come in some cases, but still usually at the last minute, and over the protest of the faculty. And so, Onkar, what do you think accounts for this disparity in the way these events have been received? Why is the response to the recent set of protests so different from the response to the UVA protests?
Yeah, I think is part of the essence of the issue. So it's important for the UVA protest. So this was Charlottesville in it's 2017, I think. So it's on the University of Virginia campus, but it's not students, or at least from what I've read of it's certainly not predominantly students. And Columbia, and I don't know if this was said in the hearing, but from what I've read about it, some of these protests are not students, they're people from outside the campus. Some are certainly students at campus, but don't take the footage as it's revealing all students. But there's certainly a number of students involved, student organizations, student groups. UVA was outside the university. And if it had been that these were all students at UVA, I think there would have been, and the university, and more broadly, if this was happening at other universities, similar kinds of rallies and protests, there would have been a real crisis at the universities. They would have been thinking, how can we have students like this on our campuses? And how can it be that our education is resulting in students who want to expel the Jews, who are white supremacists? And so there would have been a real crisis of how is it and what is going on in our classrooms that this can be the product. But they weren't students, and you didn't see students in other universities now supporting the Unite the Right rally. But what you have here are students across universities, and you could say it's across North America, but I think it's across it at least includes Europe. It includes North America and Europe. You see this all over. And it should be a crisis of how can it be that what we're teaching in so many of our classrooms is resulting in students who are pro-Hamas, who are pro-religious totalitarians. Then they want to see them succeed. They cheer them on. They hope that they get more power. It should be a crisis. And I don't view it's not a free speech crisis. It's a crisis of education, of how can this be the lessons that students are taking from their classroom and from their courses. And the fact that the hearing nominally is trying to address that, but it's so incompetent in addressing that. But to me, that is the story. It's the story of the students actually think this and believe this. And how is it possible? And particularly, it's in your Ivy League schools. These are supposedly the best schools of the country. And so many students think this, and there doesn't seem that much pushback from other students or from other faculty that these views are crazy and evil.
Yes, and maybe this is a good opportunity to look at at least one more clip. Video 2, let's look at that. This is a segment from the aforementioned congressional hearings, and a clip from the president of Columbia setting the context for how she and her administration have dealt with the protests on campus. And what struck me about this moment was so she's trying to come off as even-handed and fair, but I think maybe not realizing or hoping that we don't realize the implications of some of the things that she's saying in the course of doing it. So let's play that clip.
But on October 7th, the world changed, and so did my focus. Israel was brutally attacked by Hamas terrorists, and very soon it became clear that these horrific events would ignite fear and anguish across our campus. For thousands of our Jewish and Israeli students, the catastrophe was deeply personal. Many knew people that had been killed or taken hostage in the attack. For many other Columbia students, the war in Gaza also had profound personal implications, and also was part of a larger story of Palestinian displacement as well as a humanitarian catastrophe. Trying to reconcile the free speech rights of those who wanted to protest and the rights of Jewish students to be in an environment free of discrimination and harassment has been the central challenge on our campus and numerous others across the country. Regrettably, the events of October 7th brought to the fore an undercurrent of anti-Semitism that is a major challenge, and like many other universities, Columbia has seen a rise in anti-Semitic incidents.
So what struck me here was the utter moral equivalence that she's drawing between the two sides of this conflict, and complete deference to the to many irrational views of the students who are currently protesting. I mean, can you imagine a university professor or president in the 1940s dealing with the fact that there are, let's say, German encampments on college, and saying, well, they've been very personally affected by all the Germans who've died in the war in Europe? And it's true that there have been effects, but the effects were brought on by naked Hamas aggression against Israel. And here she's even using the talking points from the left and from Hamas about how, well, if you look at the wider context, Palestinians have been displaced by Israel and so forth. And she's offering that as kind of completely unironically as uncontroversial and without need for justification, in the attempt to make it sound like she's being even-handed. I don't know if you have any reactions to that, Onkar.
Yes, and part of the language is meant to be distancing here. So if you call Hamas a terrorist group, I don't think you are getting to the essence of what they currently are. Hamas is the governing power in Gaza. They were elected, and one of the first things they did when they were elected was to expel, drive out, kill, murder their political rivals so that they have complete dictatorial political power. They're the governing body. They're not some small organization that the governing body in Gaza is trying to get rid of, and so, but there's terrorists that they can't uproot out of Gaza. They're the government of Gaza. It's not a state exactly, but they're the governing body and have to be thought of as such. Even you earlier put it, Hamas's military wing. I don't think of it like that. It's any more than I think of when you think of Iran. Well, it has a military wing. It's the Iranian government doing this. And Hamas wants to make it like this. Of the people who are supposedly the more politically oriented, we're voted in. Yeah, like we don't know what the military wing is doing. They want to distance themselves in that way so they don't have to have culpability for what happens. But it's a farce. And other groups like in Ireland try to do this kind of thing. And it's wrong to think of it like this. So and that's why the parallel to Japan or Germany is a relevant parallel. You wouldn't make it that, oh, well, there were some German terrorists doing this. No, it's Germany attacking Poland and at war in Europe. And it's the same as Hamas is the governing body here. And so if you're going to talk about Hamas in that way, you put it, it's already some of the talking points. Those are some of the talking points in the conceptualization that Hamas wants. And if you take seriously that Hamas is the governing body, it has a political program, it has charters. And if you read those charters and think, oh, like Israel and Hamas are basically the same, Israel's the form of government in Israel, that's to make a mockery of freedom. Israel, whatever its flaws, is essentially a free country or a semi-free country. But as free countries or relatively free countries go now, it's a free country. And Hamas is a dictatorship. And if you've got a university president who can't make that distinction, she can't recognize a dictatorship or is trying to play it around, that's just, you're trying to play down the issue and what's at stake here. And that's an act of cowardice.
Let's go perhaps one layer deeper into that, because earlier you had said something I think nobody else is saying on this issue, which is that the essential problem here is not anti-Semitism, that there's some other ideological, I mean, you suggested there's another ideological fault that accounts for the kinds of things we're hearing, not only from the protesters, but from the president. And do you want to say more about that? What is the deeper problem here if it's not anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so I think anti-Semitism is part of it, but part of what fuels anti-Semitism throughout the modern age, certainly, but I think it goes back to the ancient world as well. But if you think and including Germany and what happened in Europe, it's that the Jews are economically successful. They're prosperous. They value business. And you see that in what has been built in Israel. So part of the relevance that in that region, it's the only free country. That's an enormous achievement. That is what the Israeli state they've built, and in the last 30 years have turned much more towards an entrepreneurial, business-oriented economy versus real flirting with socialism early on in the history of Israel, and that set it back. So it's an oasis of freedom, of valuing entrepreneurship, business. So you can think of it as it's a representative of capitalism and of the Enlightenment, which brought capitalism, a new form of economic organization and a new social system into existence that has brought enormous, undreamt of prosperity to every region of the world that has tried to implement these ideas. And the fact is, there are many people, and certainly in academia and in universities, we both have graduate degrees from universities, we've both seen this firsthand of how much animus there is towards capitalism, towards business, towards entrepreneurship, towards building something to become economically successful. And I think you can't understand the animus towards Israel, part of which then manifests as anti-Semitism. But it's not just about the Jewish religion or Jews as a race. It's that they're representative of money, of success, of business. And to understand that how you can have so many students who have this viewpoint, if you put it into Israel is a representative of capitalism, they're taught in so many of their courses that capitalism is the problem, not the solution to economic poverty and devastation and to a lack of freedom. And if you see it in that lens, then it should not be surprising. And when you read some of the statements and some of the ways that the anti-Israeli viewpoint is expressed now, I think you'll see this all over the colonial power, and so that's a shorthand for that. It's a representative of capitalism and the Enlightenment, and that's its sin.
I think we can extend that point about hatred of economic success to another issue, which is military strength. And you mentioned before, Onkar, that the allegedly anti-war protesters don't bother protesting the civil war in Yemen or in Syria, where probably many more innocent people are being killed than in Gaza. And it's also worth pointing out that when Israel is attacked, they don't have the same kind of reaction either. And here the point is not just about October 7th, but about the recent attack by Iran using ballistic missiles and drones on Israel. Iran not having been previously attacked by Israel. I saw scenes of the news of this attack being spread at various protests, and the protesters cheering the fact that Israel had been attacked. And it makes me think that, friends of ours have noted in the past that the left's attitude toward Israel changed dramatically when it started winning wars, when it started winning especially in the 6-Day War, and because before that it had been viewed as a weak, oppressed power in its own right. Once it started winning against the hostile Arab aggressors, the left's view changed, and I think you see the same dynamic at work in the way allegedly anti-war protesters think about attacks on Israel today. And it also makes me think that the timing of these most recent protests is significant, because the timing comes just a week or so after Iran's attack on Israel, when the tide was starting to change in Israel's favor in terms of sympathy, because here's another unprovoked attack against Israel, and barely manages to defend itself. That is to say, does very little in reaction, kind of pinprick strike against Iran. And so Israel's starting to look like a victim again. I would think that the leaders of this movement don't like that, because they thrive from worship of victimhood. They thrive from worship and defense of weakness. And so they need to take the spotlight off of this attack and put it back onto the Gazans, put it back onto stories of misery in Gaza, out of context, of course, because they brought it on themselves. And so this also points, doesn't it, to the deeper ideological root of this reaction, which is ultimately the altruistic worship of the misery of the other, as against strength and ability. Do you have comments or thoughts on that?
Yes, I definitely think that is true, and it reveals the naked essence of altruism, that it's not actually about lifting up the supposed poor, needy. It's the target of altruism is that the successful, the prosperous, the productive are, one, ashamed of what they've done and should be sacrificed, destroyed, eliminated. That's the real animus, and you see it over and over again, but it's most clear, I think, in foreign policy. The stakes are high, they're life and death, and there's clear good and clear evil in foreign policy. And the whole attitude towards Iran, we've talked a little bit about Yemen, Syria, the attitude towards Iran, that you would not view this as a vicious regime that is destroying its own people. That's what every dictatorship, every totalitarian system does. The first victims are its own civilian population. And then it usually has to go to war with surrounding countries. This is a point that Ayn Rand made, and we can think of it in terms of the supposed today anti-war protesters, but it's a point she made about the anti-war protesters in the 60s. If you're not against dictatorship, you're not against war. A dictatorship is at war, and literally at war with its own people. And if that doesn't bother you, And one of the ways Ayn Rand put it is like if so it's a war where one side is legally disarmed. The civilian population, if you think in Iran, is legally disarmed, and they're terrorized by their own government. That it's a civil war in the sense that, well, one side has won and has had all the power, but it's literally at war with its own citizens. And if that doesn't bother you, then you're not anti-war. The idea that Israel can't do anything against other countries, but we couldn't care less what Iran does to its own citizens, its own civilian population. And again, like, where are the protests in regard to Iran? And if you think, like, there's been heroic protest demonstrators in Iran demanding more freedom and freedom from the religious totalitarianism. Where were these protesters on campuses today supporting those people in Iran? They don't care. And this is in the hearings. There's a professor at Columbia who published something pro the Hamas and pro the attacks on, I think, October 8th, the day after the attack on Israel. This is what he said about Iran in the article. Iran has neither been responsible for the murder of millions around the world, nor for colonizing or occupying the lands of others. And in the article, like, America and France are worse than Iran. And completely unmentioned is Iran has murdered and terrorizes millions of its own population. And that, we don't care at all about that. And that is revealing of do they care about the needy, the poor, or is it what they want to destroy is America, France, Israel? That, like, if they accomplish that, then they've succeeded in getting to what they're after. And that is the viewpoint. And you have to face it's enormously evil, but you can't whitewash the viewpoint that they care about the needy, the poor, and so on. What they're after is destroying free countries.
Good. I think we should spend at least a little bit of time talking about an issue that has been invoked by university administrators and by, I think, also by the congressional hearings as a kind of rationalization for how far things have come with these protests. But it's worth explaining why it's a rationalization, and that's the issue of free speech. So in that same testimony, the Columbia president says that she, especially because she saw it as kind of these two morally equivalent groups who were in conflict with each other, there was then a question of balancing the free speech rights of the protesters with the safety of other students on campus, especially Jewish students and pro-Israel students. And Onkar, this is something I know you've written and thought a lot about, but is this even a free speech issue in the first place, especially when we're talking about the context of a college campus?
No, and particularly when we're here talking about, if we're talking about Columbia University, we're talking about a private college. The First Amendment, and that's part of what they're evoking, is about limiting the power of government. It doesn't tell private citizens or private organizations how they have to function, what their policies should be. And there's a whole mix, if you, in the hearing, for instance, but it's all over the conversation. There's a mix between what are Columbia's policies in regard to what can student groups do, and where are they allowed to gather, and if they're going to have rallies, where is that allowed? When is it disrupting classes, university life, people being able to get to certain buildings? So, and a university can set policies like that. That's not a free speech issue. It's an issue of what the university's policies are given the goals of the university, and it's essentially an education institution. And part of what came up in the hearing of the I forget, it was two people on the board of governors, I think, and then one who's head of the anti-Semitism task force, or I think it was called task force at Columbia, in addition to the president. And the person, the head of the task force, I think he said, at least, I mean, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched at least an hour and a half, said at least 5 times in an hour and a half, these policies have to be applied consistently. And that, I think, has been a major issue on universities, that they are not applied consistently. And that if you're joining the university, paying tuition, and Ivy League schools, the tuition can be enormous. You expect, like, if the university says these are our policies and procedures, you're expecting them to apply equally to all students. Not the university is going to cherry pick, well, these rules and regulations apply to some and not others. So that is a real issue, I think, in regard to the university. But it's not a free speech issue, but it nevertheless is an important issue. And it goes to the issue of if it were, again, to go back to the UVA protest and the Unite the Right, if it were that kind of viewpoint that would be labeled fascism, I think it would be, oh yeah, like, this is intolerable on our campus, this is harassment, intimidation, we really have to stop this. And I mean, if some of what the clips you took from the congressional hearing, clearly some of it rises to the level of threats and harassment, and that if that's not dealt with, it's true that it's a double standard.
One of the things that I found especially concerning about the use of the free speech concept to understand what's going on campus and try to analyze it is precisely the way in which there's a mixing between this concept and the use of and the rules that a private institution will properly have in order to set the bounds of civil discourse and in an educational setting. And one thing I noticed repeatedly in this hearing was whenever the college administrators would talk about the value of free speech, the way they would delimit it in their mixed understanding is to say free speech it protects your speech, but it doesn't protect harassment, intimidation, or discrimination. And packaged in with that discrimination idea with them is the notion of anything that's just subjectively hurtful or offensive to an audience. And I mean, that's the kind of package that you would expect when you mix what's properly a concept delimiting what a government can do without violating the rights of another person with what institutions want to, the rules that institutions want to have to make an educational setting civil and rational. So it's a problem right there, because it then, if you import a political concept into a private setting, that ends up mangling the political concept. And it's what you would expect, I think, from academics who are, otherwise don't have a principled understanding of the way free speech should apply politically. They're the ones who often think that so-called hate speech should not be protected by free speech on similar grounds, that anything that's offensive to some party, that you should be able to have a legal claim against the speaker. And then what happens in that hearing is especially interesting, because you have the Republican congressmen who see themselves as the critics of the universities, basically taking that same notion on board and saying, if free speech does not protect anything that's subjectively offensive, if free speech doesn't protect anything that offends somebody, well, then it's the job of government to go into the universities and, in fact, regulate them to stop people from being offended. And so you get all these kinds of questions from congressmen about hiring and firing and who should be on staff and who shouldn't. And even so there's this impetus then for government oversight of the educational curriculum of a private institution that's being leveraged by this left-wing understanding of free speech that packages together both objective rights violations with subjective offense. You have thoughts on this issue? I know you've thought a lot about the boundaries of free speech and what it covers and what it doesn't, and how the concept can be misapplied.
Yes, it's inherently. So I said Columbia is a private university, but in our system today, I think of them as nominally private, but given the amount of government intervention in education, including higher education, and include the funding of higher education, is government intrusion in education. It's now not trying to censor particular viewpoints, it's trying to boost particular viewpoints, particular researches, or just academic university life in general. If you think just the level of student loans, and that's a big political issue now of the Biden and the Democrats trying to forgive so many student loans. And I think it's right to think of that as partly that's to win over votes. It's to get young people, look at what we've done for you. When you go vote, shouldn't you be voting Democratic? And all of that is government involvement in higher education. And so to think of it, well, you've got private, they're nominally private. So much of the funding and regulations of universities comes from government. And in that context, you can understand the perspective that, well, aren't there then First Amendment issue? Government's involved here, and government is supposed to be viewpoint neutral when it's involved in things, if it's going to respect the First Amendment. And so you get it's given I think what Ayn Rand would call the mixed economy in higher education today, it's natural to think, well, government's obviously involved, so don't the principles that govern how the government should operate, including the First Amendment, don't they somehow have to govern in terms of universities? And so that you'll get the congressman asking about, well, is there viewpoint discrimination? Do you have true viewpoint diversity? And so on. There would be an issue if the military was doing this, for instance, like take a full government organization. If the military were discriminating, we don't want atheists that would be a major issue and a major harm that the military is involved in. And there's a natural that the universities aren't the military, but there's a lot of government involvement. So shouldn't it be viewpoint neutral? What was a university that's viewpoint neutral? Its inherent thing is we're going to teach. And so we're going to teach certain things and not other things. It's inherently, any form of education is discriminatory in that sense. Of the vast body of human inquiry and what is claimed as knowledge, a university has to make all kinds of decisions about its curriculum, about the professors it hires, what the criteria are, what the range of viewpoints they want at the university. It has to do all this. That's what a university is. But then when government's involved, it shouldn't be doing this. It should just be viewpoint neutral. And so there were questions. Now they're lame questions because of the idea of what they think of as a viewpoint, and they'll put it as viewpoint diversity. There are questions about how many Republicans versus Democrats do you have on your faculty, as though like that's the range of viewpoints. But that you would get questions like that is natural, given what higher education in America is today. And there's no solution in the end to this question. I think the proper solution, it's not a full solution, but the university by its nature, as I said, is discriminatory. And it has to be able to make decisions like this. And it can't be that the government now tells the universities, these are the faculty you have to hire, these ones you can't hire, you have to have 40 faculty with this viewpoint, 50 with this. That would be the complete takeover of the universities by the government, but the messy environment of a mixed economy is not a solution either. But what you would need to try to do is start freeing it up, not we need more government control over this.
Let's talk about one last related issue that you've also done some work on, which is the issue of freedom of assembly, which has also been invoked, not so much by the university administrators in this case, but by the protesters themselves in defense of the kinds of invasions of campuses and occupation of other both public and private spaces, like what we're seeing at Columbia. This idea that the freedom of assembly entails the right to occupy or the right to mass protest is a common viewpoint, and yet and they claim that they are peaceful protesters. But what do you think of that, Onkar?
Yeah, this is something that Ayn Rand wrote on, and I think her analysis is profound and important, which is you have to make a distinction between the action of speech, of expression, of communication, which inherent in that is that people cannot listen, not hear, they can walk away. And when we're talking, so you have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly on your own property, using your property to talk to people, to write what you want to write, to meet with whom you want, to discuss ideas with them. So you don't have that. The right does not extend to so-called public spaces. Now, there's a whole question of whether there should be public spaces. But if there are, you brought up the Golden Gate Bridge. So if the bridge is, it's viewed as it's publicly owned, it's public property, it has a certain purpose. It's for people to be able to get over a body of water, to get to home or to work. It's for them to be able to travel. That's the whole argument is government has to provide roads and bridges because a private economy wouldn't do that. That's not true. But if that's the argument, then it's what we need these things for is to be able to get around. They're not forums where anybody can just go and say, I'm holding a protest, here's my views, I'm blocking all traffic, nobody can get to work or get back home or get to the hospital because we have this view and we want to have everybody know that we've got this view. So it makes a travesty of why this public property exists in the first place, and it leaves everybody else unfree. That is, I don't have now a choice of whether I'm going to be involved in this assembly or not. I'm stuck on the bridge because they're not allowing people to pass. And people, I mean, when you watch these kinds of protests, sometimes they get out of hand and drivers start dragging them off the road because they just want to get by. And people think, well, that's violence. But the initial use of force or violence is the protesters blocking the bridges, blocking the streets. And it has to be held like this. This is not speech communication where you're leaving people free not to listen. And the moment that you're doing that, you're the one who's using force, not the people who are trying to get you off the bridge. So they're just using it in retaliation. And if that's not understood, the whole issue of what freedom of speech is, why it's valuable, and why that the freedom of action of one person is compatible with the freedom of action of the other person, that they both have free speech rights, you've lost that whole understanding if you label these kinds of things as, yeah, this is within the scope of someone's freedom of speech.
This is one of the reasons why I found the university administrators' analysis of what was problematic with the protests to be so vacuous. Their focus was on that last part of what they said wasn't covered by free speech or assembly, the fact that it was discriminatory or that it offended someone. And they would constantly put the emphasis on Jewish students on our campus don't feel safe. But for the reasons that you've just expressed, the feelings here are irrelevant. It's that they aren't safe. that because of the physical intrusion that's been made onto their campus, because the initial act of force was the occupation, which stopped them from being able to go to class, which stopped professors on the campus from being able to enter. I don't know if there was a video of one Jewish professor showing his ID, trying to get into the campus, but being surrounded by protesters who would simply not let him access his own office. I mean, that is not a subjective issue. That's an objective threat to his safety and more generally to his freedom, the freedom that he has in virtue of being an employee at that university. Onkar, this is an issue I think will continue to be on our radar screen over the next few months, because these protests are not likely going away anytime soon. So I hope we hear more from you about it.
It's worth here just also talking about it outside of the campuses, because this issue's not understood, but it's leveraged in I think essentially dishonest ways. And this now goes beyond the university administrations to, you can think both of the politicians and governments, but also what would be called the mainstream media. And this is also what's relevant about the UVA protests. But if you think of the other mass protests that have happened, of the BLM protests during COVID, of the anti-lockdown protest. And so I've been following this. I'm Canadian, so I have a little bit of interest in still what is happening in Canada. But the contrast in Canada between the anti-COVID protests, or the anti-lockdown protest, and the most well-known is the truckers who went to Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And that protest was broken up. And I think essentially the protesters were smeared. And this is how one of the smears worked. There were allegations that one trucker had a Confederate flag. There were smears, but there's no evidence that this is the protest is essentially connected to being pro-Confederacy. There's questions of whether there even was this flag or not. But the idea of painting all these protesters as, well, you're for the Confederacy. And this was used as, so you're not just peaceful protesters, you're threatening. And so we have to break this up. And that's what happened in Canada. The protest was broken up. You have now regularly across Canadian cities, I would put they're pro-Hamas protests, calling for the destruction of Israel, calling for the death of Jews, calling for more power should be in the hands of Hamas. If that's not threatening, and in comparison to like one truck, let's say it was real that they had a Confederate flag, and let's say they were pro-Confederacy, they didn't just have a Confederate. It's not like the Confederacy is this big thing in Canada. So the whole thing was a smear of them. But here, there's real reason to think that some of these people are threatening. And yet they're allowed, the protests go on, they're not broken up. And if you look at both, so that's the government's treatment of them. And if you look at the mainstream media's treatment of them, and the denigration of the truckers versus these people who they openly tell you over and over what their viewpoint is. You don't have to find some one symbol that they have and then interpret that and say, and then paint everybody agrees with this. They tell you over and over in their chants, in their speeches, what they stand for. And there's not like, oh yeah, these protests should be broken up. And that tells you something both about, put it just, of what is taught in universities and then what has made it out of the universities into government and into mainstream media. And it tells you something very ugly and very evil.
Yes. Start to wrap up in a minute here. I want to start by thanking a number of people who've given us super chats. No questions attached to them, but just so thank you, Wes and Mark, for your support on this. I think I want to wrap up by sharing a quotation from an essay that I want to recommend to our audience, because so much of what she wrote in it applies to the controversy today. It's from Ayn Rand's essay, The Cashing In the Student Rebellion, which she wrote in 1965, and she wrote it about the student anti-war protests, primarily at UC Berkeley, but also at Columbia, interestingly. And in this essay, she talks about many of the issues that we've been talking about today, about the misapplication of the concept of free speech, about the misapplication of freedom of assembly, and about the various irrational ideological motivation of both the protesters and of their supporters on university campuses. And I'll just close with this passage from that essay, which is kind of her recommendation for the positive alternative. Once you've exposed the real meaning of what the other side stands for, which I think we've started to do today, and she's speaking to young people who see themselves, who are frustrated with what's going on campus. And she says, if young people seek an important cause, they have the opportunity to fight the rebels, to fight ideologically on moral intellectual grounds, by identifying and exposing the meaning of the rebels' demands, by naming and answering the basic principles which the rebels dare not admit. The battle consists above all of providing the country, or all of those within hearing, with ideological answers, a field of action from which the older generation has deserted under fire. The first goal of such a battle is to wrest from a handful of beatniks the title of spokesman for the American youth, which the press is so anxious to grant them. The first step is to make oneself heard on the campus and outside. And she goes on to talk about how there are many ways to make yourself heard that don't involve having to get into the fracas with the actual protesters. This is one of the things we're doing here, and one of the things we help young people to do more generally in the wider culture at the Ayn Rand Institute. So that's taken from her essay, The Cashing In the Student Rebellion. I don't know if we have an item to put on screen showing that source, but oh, good, we do. This was reprinted in her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which obviously contains a lot of other information on issues we talked about today as well. So thank you for having this discussion. Let's also remind our viewers that if they liked this episode, they should be sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube and to click the bell to get notifications when we go live, when we post new recordings. Same thing if you're watching the recording, please be sure to like, to comment on it, share the episode to attract new viewers. Please do the same if you're on Facebook. If you have any questions or comments about things we talked about today, or if you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything that comes in and try to answer as much of it as we can. So thank you, Onkar, for analyzing this with me today. It's a really important ongoing issue. I'm sure we'll have more to say about it in the future. Thanks, everyone.